Warning: the following presentation is intended for mature audiences and it contains graphic descriptions of crime scenes, adult dialogue, and strong language. This podcast represents the opinions of the hosts and their guests, and every effort is made to ensure that information is accurate. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome, fellow armchair detectives. I'm your host, Ashleigh.
And I'm your host, Tamlyn Rossouw.
And this is Just in Crime. Join us as we explore the issue of gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa
by exploring the victims and their stories.
In the early hours of March the 3rd, 2014, Mrs Dolly Singh arrived home after a night out with some friends. When she arrived, she found the lifeless body of her daughter, Ashika Singh, lying on the bed. She had been strangled. The house had been ransacked, but it wasn't Ashika's missing phone or car that rang alarm bells. It was her missing live-in boyfriend. This is the case of Ashika Singh. Ashika Singh is a 35-year-old woman who's described as bubbly and happy-go-lucky by the type of people around her. I couldn't find much information on her, but from what I gathered, she was a really religious person who tried to follow a good lifestyle. She had a very stable job as a financial advisor and was growing in her career. However, the same could not be said for her boyfriend, Mark Donovan Ramdas. Ramdas is a 31-year-old man who is unemployed but manages to get work from time to time. He lived a slightly troubled childhood as he was introduced to drugs from a very young age by his father. His parents divorced when he was about 18 months old, and his mother remarried and moved to Pietermaritzburg. Mark was raised by his maternal aunt and his grandparents, and he said that he felt very neglected by his mom. These troubles were something that he had carried with him throughout his whole life, and while he was not like a massive party animal, he did have the occasional drink. Mark, however, did have trouble with drugs. However, when we looked at how the family dealt with this, it didn't seem like they were nervous about it or concerned, as he was attending NA meetings. So for those of you who don't know, NA is Narcotics Anonymous. And the couple themselves, while they did fight a lot, it was nothing that really drew attention to them. And it was something that they felt that they could work through. And they even planned on getting married in the near future. So, one day, Ashika, her boyfriend Mark, and her mother Dolly, who all lived in Merebank, Northdale, Pietermaritzburg, on the 2nd of March 2014, went to a shopping mall to have lunch. Everything seemed pretty normal and nothing was out of the ordinary. After lunch, Ashika had dropped her boyfriend Mark at a bar so he could have some drink with his friends. Ashika and her mom then made their way home. Mark returned home later that evening and was very clearly very, very, very drunk and not acting like his usual self at all. Everyone kind of just let this slide because it wasn't something that happened often, so they thought they could just turn a blind eye. A few minutes later, Mark and Ashika left together, and apparently they went to an address where Mark used to go to buy drugs. They later returned home at 8 p.m. When they arrived, nothing seemed off, and Ashika went to go have a bath, and then later joined her mom in the lounge. A friend of Mrs. Singh's then arrived at the house at about 8:30 to fetch her so they could go to a local casino. When Mrs. Singh arrived in the early hours of the morning, she found that she could not open her driveway gate. And when she went to figure out why it wouldn't open, she realized that it had been purposefully jammed. However, she didn't think this was a problem and she entered through the neighbor's property. She unlocked the doors to her house and entered. When she walked in, the television was on quite loud and all the lights were on. She started to look through the house, and the more she explored, she had seen that it had been ransacked. Cupboard doors were open and clothes and other items were lying all over the floor of the house. She then went to find her daughter, and when she walked into her room, she found her lifeless body lying there with a plastic bag over her head. She was dead. There was no one else in the house. All the doors were locked and there was no sign of forced entry. Obviously, in a complete state of shock, she started to scream, and shortly, her neighbors, who she was also related to, ran over. While this was a terrible scene and everyone was shocked at what had played out, it wasn't necessarily what was in the house that rang alarm bells, but rather what was missing. The courtesy car which Ashika had been using while her car was in repairs was not there, and neither was Mark. The car was luckily, however, fitted with a tracking device and quickly located where it was parked in the point area of Mahatma Gandhi Road. But the car was there, but Mark was still missing. Later that morning at about 11 a.m., Mark responded to an SMS which was sent to his cell phone by his cousin. He was in Umhlanga Rocks. When his cousin collected him from there, Mark had a rucksack which contained Ashika's cell phone, her Garmin navigation device, her house keys, and her charger for her camera. His cousin then told Mark that Ashika had been strangled, and Mark seemed completely shocked, as if this was the first time hearing this. So dude, looking at these facts objectively, who do you think would have committed this crime?
Obviously, it's the boyfriend. It's always the boyfriend.
And I mean, there's no signs of forced entry. All we have is Mark missing. Mark, who was acting weirdly and had been using drugs and alcohol. So I mean, obviously, all the signs point to him. In fact, it is so obvious that Mark himself agrees that the facts overwhelmingly suggest that he was the one who killed Ashika. He, however, said that he had no recollection of it, and he blamed his state of intoxication on crack cocaine and alcohol.
Oh, dude, why is it always crack cocaine?
I don't know, dude, and I feel like crack is just such a cis drug. Ew, what is the appeal? I do not get it at all. Why would you even do it?
No, I don't understand. Honestly, I think if you took Ratex, it would probably be less harmful to you.
Yeah, no, crack is just honestly one of those drugs that I'm gonna look down at. I don't know why, but I just can't. So, a few days later, Mark decided he was gonna hand himself over to the police and told them that they should launch a full investigation into his involvement in the killing of Ashika. So, he thinks he did it, but at the end of the day, he has absolutely no recollection of being there. And I mean, I guess besides circumstantial evidence, there isn't anything that really ties him to it at this point. Obviously, when police further investigated into the case, they found that Ashika had been strangled around the neck, first with an extension cord, and then a plastic bag was put over her head. It was also concluded that Mark was in fact the one who did that. I mean, when we're looking at a situation where some form of femicide or homicide has occurred within a house, it's really difficult to collect evidence, as anyone living in that house, their evidence is literally everywhere. So it's even difficult to say that he was the one who strangled her with the extension cord, because his fingerprints and his DNA could be on there, regardless of the murder. He could have just used it that day. So, I mean, that is one thing that was also very interesting in this case. Another reason, and we'll see as we're about to jump into the court cases, the power dynamic between the two also comes out as something that's very interesting to look at. And this is one of the reasons we went with this case. So before we jump into the court proceedings, we just want to say be sure to check us out on Instagram and Facebook at Just in Crime SA for more episodes, case-related content, updates, and other riveting content.
Also, always keep in mind that we are not professionals in any of the discussed fields. If you or anyone you know is in danger, you can find resources on our social media pages, or alternatively, you can call the Gender-Based Violence Command Center at 0800 428 428 or SMS help to 31531.
So, when we look at the court case, there are two primary issues that was basically raised with the state that dealt with criminal capacity in terms of whether Mark could tell right from wrong in the situation or could exercise self-control. So just basically to explain what that means. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, in South African law, a person who kills another person is only punished if he did so with criminal capacity and with the intention to kill or negligently. Criminal capacity in this context basically means that the person can appreciate like the wrongfulness of their act, and then in terms of also appreciating it, that they're able to act in accordance with that. So they need to be able to identify that something's wrong and then act according to that. If a person lacked such capacity, it is then said that he acted unlawfully, and the issue relating to the intention or the negligence does not arise. So basically, I also mentioned this, I think it was in the previous case of Ashika and Mishka. If you haven't looked at those ones, be sure to check it out. But basically, I mentioned that voluntary drunkenness, unless it results in mental disease or mental illness in South Africa, it can't say that you do not have criminal capacity. And it basically says that you are criminally responsible. So in layman's terms, if you are a person and you are drunk and you commit a crime, you cannot blame the fact that you were drunk on the crime. That is what the general law says. However, this was not what happened in the case.
I definitely agree with that. Like, you are the reason that you are intoxicated and that you're drunk, and because it was your choice, you should definitely pay the price for what happens afterwards.
I agree. However, this doesn't seem to apply in this case. Basically, the defense argued that it is illogical and said the following: whenever a person commits an act and is so drunk that he does not realize what he has done was unlawful or that his inhibitions have been substantially disintegrated, he can be regarded as not having criminal capacity or being criminally responsible. If there is a reasonable doubt, the accused ought to be given the benefit thereof. Someone who is dead drunk is not conscious of what he is doing and therefore not liable because of muscular movements which is done in the condition is not a criminal act. If someone does an act more than an involuntary muscular movement but is so drunk that he does not realize what he is doing or he does not appreciate the unlawfulness of the act, he is not criminally responsible. And to me, that is complete rubbish. Complete rubbish. Because then, by that logic, I can basically go and get drunk and then rob a bank and just be like, I was drunk. I didn't know what I was doing. Yeah, because I was so drunk I wasn't aware of the muscular movements that were happening. But I mean, for me, that doesn't make sense. And also, from a very young age, the first thing we are taught is hurting people is wrong. And I can't think of a single society or culture, and maybe I might be wrong, where murder is accepted. Across the board, it is completely wrong. And so I don't understand how you can be so drunk or so intoxicated that you think that killing is suddenly right. It's never been right in any context, so why all of a sudden now? So for me, that argument does not make sense. However, moving away from the issue of criminal capacity and criminal responsibility, the defense started to look into the case and wanted to get some further insight into what could be the possible motive behind this murder. This was evident as he displayed violent behaviors when he smashed his windscreen and also allegedly used physical violence towards Ashika in the past. In his testimony, he defended himself by stating that Ashika was a very dominant figure in their relationship and would dictate to him how much to speak, how much food to eat, and basically what to do. He told the court that he felt belittled by the way she treated him. This obviously led to him feeling a lot of anger and frustration towards the situation, and he essentially turned to drugs. When he asked why he didn't leave the relationship in light of her controlling behavior, he said that he loved her unconditionally and believed that the issue could be dealt with and that they would just get married and go on to live a very happy life together. And I mean, I think this is just a point I want to bring up. There's definitely very clear evidence of domestic violence from both parties in this case, both Ashika and Mark. And for anyone who thinks that you're going to be in a relationship that's physically or emotionally or financially abusive and you're going to get married and all those problems are going to go away, they're probably not. If anything, it tends to get worse. So if you're in a situation like that, I'm going to strongly suggest that you get out of it unless that situation can resolve itself in a healthy light. So the state argued that Mark's goal-directed behavior in terms of locking the security gate and jamming the driveway and then driving 14 kilometers to Mshlanga shows that regardless of his drinking and drug intake, that he is fully aware of what he's doing at the time. If you have amnesia and you can't remember, how do you remember to drive? Like, that doesn't make sense to me. So they went on to say that Mark's inability to remember or recall does not mean that he lacked criminal capacity and does not render him criminally non-responsible. So, I mean, for me, I thought this would be a pretty easy case. Like, he very clearly did it. He should go to jail. But I know that this broke the hearts of many people. So, while the state had said that Mark was responsible for the murder of Ashika, the judge, Jonah Plus van Amstel, had ruled that the accused had drunk excessively and smoked crack cocaine on the night that he killed his girlfriend and had too much to drink to render him criminally responsible. While there was speculation about the couple's argument and Mark needing potential money for drugs that caused conflict, and that Ashika's strong personality could have led him to murdering her. However, there was absolutely no evidence to support these motives. So essentially, the issue in this case was not that he didn't do it. It was kind of that issue that comes into our criminal justice system of the state wasn't able to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And so therefore, 2 weeks later, he was acquitted for the murder on all counts. So we think the story ends there, and unfortunately it does take another sad turn. After he was acquitted, Mark committed suicide. He was found dead with a gunshot wound to his head, and upon further investigation, there were no signs of foul play present. Captain Mobile Gwala said a firearm was found in his hand and an inquest docket had been opened at Mountain Rise Saps. So I just want to also jump in here about what an inquest docket is in case anyone's confused. So when someone dies, you get a murder docket and then you get an inquest docket. So if you don't know why a person died, that is where they write it in. So not all murders are technically written down as murders, or in this case, it was a suicide, but they hadn't been able to rule that immediately. So it went into an inquest docket. So when Singh's family was asked about what had happened, a close relative says that they had received some information from Mark claiming that he committed suicide for two reasons. One, a current girlfriend of his had come out saying that she is part of the LGBTQ plus community, which again, to me, just sounds like a rubbish excuse. Like, that doesn't make sense. But the second reason does. Apparently, Mark's drug problem was a lot bigger than most had expected, and he owed a lot of money to a drug dealer. And I mean, we've all watched the movies, we've watched the cases, we've heard the stories. You never want to owe money to a drug dealer, and I think it can end up being a situation if you don't kill yourself, they'll probably kill you until they get their money. So, I mean, that happened. A family friend of the Singhs stated that the family is not remorseful or sad that Mark took his own life, and they are still devastated that they never got justice for their slain daughter who was taken away far too soon. They then further said, "We have been waiting for justice for 6 years now, and he is gone. We finally have closure. We don't think about him. He is out of our lives for good." So, Tam, what did you think of this case?
Dude, I think firstly that this case is a typical example of intimate partner femicide and also shows the kind of flaws that exist within our justice system.
Exactly. If I was the judge in that case, honestly, he would be in prison. I don't care how drunk you are or if you decided to spend your night doing drugs. You killed someone. That is someone's life and you don't really have the right to take it away. But as I mentioned previously in the case, the issue of gender-based violence does come up here. And I know that Singh's mom, so Ashika's mom, Dolly, had said that she wouldn't say that the relationship was abusive. However, when it was described as people, both of them were shouting at each other, degrading each other, especially in Mark's testimony where he said that Ashika was, he felt belittled by her. While that isn't an excuse to take someone's life, that is a form of gender-based violence. It's a form of domestic abuse. So we do have to take that into consideration, but it worked both ways, and he did the same thing to her. I assume that he was also, he would say mean, nasty things. I think the fights might have gotten physical once or twice, but nothing too much. But even once or twice it's more than it should have ever occurred. So in conclusion, I feel like while this issue of domestic violence had come up, there was one party who took it too far, and that is Mark. I don't think the sentencing was fair. I don't think he should have been acquitted. I think he should have had to serve his time for his choices that he made. And honestly, at the end of the day, this case just makes me really upset about how our justice system can really let people down.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. Be sure to check out our social media for more episodes, case-related content, and other riveting info.
We'd also like to give a massive shout out to Christian Putter for creating our theme song. Be sure to check out more of his work on Instagram at Christian_Putter.
And then we would also just like to thank Anthony Catano for creating our album art. So be sure to follow him at @AntCatano on Instagram.
And lastly, we'd like to give a huge shout out to VU Media for helping produce this podcast. Be sure to follow them on Facebook and Insta at VU_Media SA.